Like I said before, validity refers to a measure's accuracy. A common definition of validity is when something measures what it is supposed to measure. In the hiring context, a predictor is valid if it is appropriate for use as a selection tool for a particular job. So that sales knowledge test we talked about might be valid for a sales position, but not for an accounting job. As we'll see, for hiring, a measure's validity boils down to primarily three things. Number one, how well does it measure the construct? Number two, how accurate does it look to those who use it? And number three, how well does it predict job performance? Let's take each one of these in turn. First, we have content validity. This refers to whether the items or questions on a measure are representative or adequately sample the desired universe of possible content. Think about a final exam for a college course. The instructor could probably put hundreds or thousands of different items on the test to cover all of the material, but there's just not enough time to take or to grade a test like that. Instead, he or she will choose a sample of items to represent the course content. If you've ever complained that a test was weighted too heavily toward a particular subset of material or didn't tap your knowledge of a particular part of the course, you're essentially saying, hey, I question this measure's content validity. And you probably didn't say it like that, but that's the gist of it. So where does content validity fit in our earlier diagram? It's essentially a match between your measure and the abstract construct that you're trying to tap, right here. So here's an example. Now, unlike with reliability, we don't get a correlation coefficient to establish content validity because there's no way to get directly at the construct. If there was, we wouldn't need the measure in the first place. Instead, we get a group of subject matter experts to look at the test, and given their expertise with the construct, they will hopefully identify any problems. So here we have a test with three parts: verbal, numerical, and spatial. And each of these circles represents an item. So we could say that this is an intelligence test. It has three components, and we could call it, quite modestly, the flawless intelligence test. Now there's two possible types of problems. Inadequate representation, which would be when we don't hit one area of content sufficiently. So for here you can see that we're doing a fairly good job of measuring verbal and numerical ability, but there's not enough content on the test to cover spatial ability. And irrelevance is when we have items that don't map on to any of the content. So there's one item over there that's not in the circle at all. Maybe it's asking about whether we like anchovies on our pizza or something like that, but it has nothing to do with the actual content of the test. The measure can be revised based on what the subject matter experts tell us to drop any irrelevant items, like the anchovy question, or to add new items when there is a hole in what we've measured. The second type of validity is face validity, and it's related to content validity, but face validity is whether the measure looks like it taps what it's supposed to the layperson. In hiring contexts, we think of this especially as how an applicant would respond to looking at a particular test or measure. This is not really a quality of the measure itself, but how it's interpreted by those who take it. We're especially concerned with the face validity of a measure because there are possible negative consequences if people think that our test doesn't measure something relevant to the job. For example, the organization may lose credibility in the community, disgruntled applicants may discourage others from working there, and it could even lead to lawsuits. Now, it's important to note that a face valid test might not actually be valid. So while face validity is important for public perception reasons, it's not an indication that your test is actually useful for predicting performance. Finally, we have criterion-related validity, which is the bread and butter of industrial psychology. With this kind of validity, we ask how well does a predictor estimate or predict a criterion. In other words, do the test or interview scores help us predict high performance on the job later? Going back to our figure, we can see that criterion-related validity has to do with the link between two measures, a predictor and a criterion. So how do we do this? We obtain this kind of validity by having people take the test, and then we obtain some measure of performance and see if those two scores are correlated. In this scatter plot, there's a clear, but not perfect, relationship between test scores and sales performance measured as commission. This would suggest that the test would be a valid measure to include in the hiring process. Most of the time this is done with current employees rather than applicants, and it's called a concurrent validity study. This might seem a little problematic because employees may know things that applicants wouldn't, but it's usually unreasonable to measure a bunch of applicants and then hire every single one of them, which is what you'd have to do to get performance scores 6 months or a year later. It turns out, happily, that a concurrent approach, which is much more practical, seems to be a reasonable substitute. What about the relationship between reliability and validity? Well, we need both. Both reliability and validity are important for hiring and all psychological research, by the way, because you need to choose measures that will be both consistent and accurate. Reliability is nice, but by itself it's not enough. Imagine I decided that I was going to measure cognitive ability in my applicants based on what color their eyes were. Over time, I could probably get pretty good at measuring eye color consistently. But is this a valid measure of somebody's cognitive ability? Probably not. Okay, so you can have reliability without validity. But it doesn't work the same way in the other direction. In other words, you can't be accurate if you're not consistent. If scores bounce around a lot from time to time, or item to item, or rater to rater, how do you know if your score, the one that you actually got from your applicant, is accurate? So we need reliability to even have a chance at validity, but essentially we need both in order to trust the scores that we get.